Tantor Audio, a division of Recorded Books, presents A Muslim American Slave, The Life of Omar Ibn Said, by Omar Ibn Said. Translated from the Arabic, edited and with an introduction by Allah Al-Rayes, narrated by Amir Abdullah. Introduction. Arabic work, Islam and American literature. Allah Al-Rayes. In 1831, Omar Ibn Said, then a slave in the United States, was asked to write his life. Omar composed his narrative in North Carolina, having escaped from Charleston, South Carolina, where he was sold in 1807 after his transportation from Africa. His life, which he wrote in formal Arabic in a West African Maghribi script, is a unique text. Several North African slaves wrote in Arabic. Some of these writings even became famous in their writers' lifetimes. Nor were these Arabic texts limited to the United States. Muslim slaves came to other regions of the Americas, leaving Arabic writings in Panama, Colombia, Trinidad, Mexico, and especially Brazil, where Muslim slaves led the Great Revolt in 1835 in Bahia, in which the bodies of the fallen rebels carried Muslim amulets with prayers and passages from the Quran. Omar's manuscript is of singular importance, however, not only because it is the only extant autobiography written by a slave in Arabic in the United States, but also because it thus raises the question of how the life compares to the numerous narratives written by escaped slaves. In this introductory essay, I investigate these connections both by analyzing Omar's text and by exploring the influence of the network of contemporary editors and translators who worked on Omar's text. Omar's life straddles two genres: the familiar slave narrative and the largely unfamiliar genre of Arabic writings collected and circulated by Omar's editors. Omar Ibn Said was born to a wealthy father around 1770 in a West African region then called Futa Toro, between the Senegal and Gambia rivers. After early Quranic schooling, during which he learned Arabic, Omar became a teacher. He was enslaved in 1807, possibly in the course of a military campaign, and transported to Charleston. According to Thomas Paramore, after working for 2 years as a slave in Charleston and on a South Carolina rice plantation, he escaped in 1810 and made his way to Fayetteville, North Carolina, near which he was recaptured and jailed. Omar became the property of General James Owen of Bladen County, and later moved with the Owen family during the Civil War to Owen Hill, a Cape Fear farm, formerly the home of General Owen's brother, Governor John Owen, where Omar died in 1864. Omar came to the attention of the Owens after filling the walls of his room jail cell with piteous petitions to be released, all written in the Arabic language. Omar's facility with Arabic made him a local celebrity. A contemporary account notes that he wrote in a masterly hand, writing from right to left, in what was to local observers an unknown language. Another article describes him as an Arabic scholar and stresses his devoted reading of his Arabic Bible. Alan Austin observes a similar strategic hybridity. Omar was regularly willing and able to reassure all visiting Christians that he was a true convert, as he often wrote in Arabic what he called the Lord's Prayer and the 23rd Psalm. The life was neither Omar's first nor his only Arabic text. In addition to this 1831 manuscript, a number of his other Arabic inscriptions survive. In a particularly moving example, intimating his desire to go home, Omar writes in 1819, "I want to be seen in a place called Africa, in a place called Kaaba in Beur." It is this knowledge of Arabic that set Omar apart then and continues to matter prominently in our reappraisals of him. The life is not our only source for the life of Omar ibn Said. There are as the previous discussion shows. Many other references to him. Omar lived for about 35 years after he wrote his autobiographical narrative, ranging from newspaper stories to accounts of personal interviews, published 19th century scholarly articles, and family archives. Many who met him noted his distinguished bearing. Merrill's fingers are very well tapered. His whole person and gait bear marks of considerable refinement, wrote a visiting pastor. This volume, it is worth stating at the outset, is a critical study of the text and contexts of Omar's life and not a biography of the man. Omar's literacy enabled his own words to figure centrally in what we know about a former slave. Most slaves, after all, left no written records, but Omar's narrative is also an important instance of what Werner Sollers has called the long multilingual history in all genres of American literature. Omar's knowledge of Arabic plays a part in American literary and cultural history. As this essay explains, the life is a document no less fundamental to the reconstruction of a singular life than to the understandings of an important and largely unstudied episode in the annals of American slave thought. Like the meaning of all texts, Omar's autobiography's meaning, its place in literary history, varies with time, context, and readers. This book includes and considers the work of 3 sets of interpreters. Omar's Arabic literacy made his story important for a number of 19th century missionaries, ethnographers, and intellectuals, a group that will prove central to our understanding of his life. This first set of readers is explored in this essay, while my translation and the contextual essays belong to our own period and reflect our literary and cultural interests. An earlier translation of Omar's life, published in 1925 in the American Historical Review, reveals different concerns, but more importantly, perhaps a different cultural viewpoint. One distinction between the 2 translations is worth stressing. Despite the earlier translation's editor's learning and knowledge of the context of Omar's autobiography, evidenced in his introductory text, it is clear that the editor does not see the literate Mohammedans he introduces in the company of Omar as part and parcel of America's antebellum literature. Remarkably, the most recent round of attention paid to the life resulted from the manuscript's reappearance after having vanished for most of the 20th century. The editor of the 1925 text states that the manuscript was in the possession of the curator of the American Numismatic Society in New York. It later disappeared. It was discovered in an old trunk in Virginia in 1995 and purchased at an auction by a private collector who displayed it in various libraries and museums and made it accessible to scholars. The manuscript's discovery also caused a flurry of recent media attention. In our age of desktop publishing and memory sticks, we take for granted the ability of almost any writer to preserve and disseminate his or her words in permanent forms. Yet all students of literature and history ought to keep in mind that this ghostly permanence of the written word is recent. Omar wrote his narrative almost 40 years before the invention of the typewriter, and he wrote it by hand, on fragile paper, in a single manuscript. Omar Ibn Said begins his life with a surprising demurral. I cannot write my life. I have forgotten much of my talk, as well as the talk of the Maghreb. His apology deceptively echoes the rhetorical claim that the author is not up to the task, a de rigueur flourish that accompanies many a literary preface. Yet the knowledge of Arabic the narrative reveals sets Omar apart from other early African-American writers of slave narratives, in that Omar had the language, was literate before being captured, and wrote in a language that most of his enslavers could not read. Unlike Olaudah Equiano, author in 1789 of the first slave narrative by an African, or Frederick Douglass, whose autobiography stages his learning to read and write as a primal scene ironically related to his slavery, Omar did not learn the language in which he wrote his autobiography during his captivity. Furthermore, His 1831 North Carolina autobiography exposes these conventions' regional and historical specificity by not subscribing to the implicit codes of African American first-person narratives written in the North. The Life's manuscript consists of 23 pages of quarto paper, of which pages 6 to 13 are blank. Its content falls into two parts. First, a chapter from the Quran, Suratul Mulk, followed by Omar's autobiography, which opens with his aforementioned apology to a sheikh hunter, who had presumably asked Omar to write an account of his life. The narrative relates Omar's previous life in West Africa. My name is Omar Ibn Said. My birthplace is Fut Tur, between the two rivers, the Senegal and the Gambia. Omar describes his education, which lasted for 25 years under 3 Muslim sheikhs, and the grisly circumstances of his capture in 1807. Then there came to our country a big army. It killed many people. It took me and walked me to the big sea, and sold me into the hands of a Christian man. The text is silent on the horrors of the notorious Middle Passage. The author mentions only that it lasted a month and a half. Landing in Charleston, Omar is sold to his first American owner. Although he is laconic when he describes the progress of his slavery, Omar's poignant awareness of his linguistic alienation and subjection marks his memories. In a Christian language, he writes, "They sold me." The evil Johnson, Omar's first owner, puts him to work in the fields despite the fact that Omar is a small man who cannot do hard work. Omar escapes, walking north and hiding for about a month. He enters what he calls houses to pray, though it is not clear what he means by this term. Were they buildings, churches, or homes of sympathetic Southerners that served the Underground Railroad? Omar is soon spotted by a young man on horseback who denounces him to his father. A posse eventually captures Omar, walks him to Fayetteville, North Carolina, and imprisons him in the Cumberland County Jail for 16 days and nights. He is eventually sold to Jim Owen, the brother of a future governor of North Carolina. But before that, a man called Mitchell tries to buy Omar and asks him if he wants to walk to a place called Charleston, scene of his earlier suffering. The question terrifies Omar. His horror and the enduring memory of his first owner's cruelty are reflected in his unequivocal refusal. No, no, no. No, no, no. No, no. Omar concludes his autobiography with an encomium to his owner. I continue in the hands of Jim Owen, who does not beat me nor calls me bad names. During the last 20 years, I have not seen any harm at the hands of Jim Owen. He also extols Owen's progeny. This is a good generation. Tom Owen and Nell Owen had 2 sons and 1 daughter. This generation is a very good generation. O people of America, do you have such a good generation that fears Allah so much? Examining Omar's praise, as well as other contemporary reports of how they treated their slave, it appears that the Owens were kind masters. Yet Omar was never freed, and any statements regarding his masters must remain under this shadow. Omar Ibn Said's life is short. He did not raise a family in the United States, perhaps too aware that masters usually disregarded slaves' familial ties and often separated children and spouses. His life does not elaborate on his family life in Africa, neither further describing his birthplace after he mentions his kidnapping, nor openly condemning slavery or graphically dwelling on his own tribulations. Yet in this introduction, I will argue that, though unsatisfying in its autobiographical desiderata, short on what we have come to expect of both a slave narrative and a self-fashioning confession, Omar's autobiography is richly rewarding when one attends to its 2 semantic minds. First, it is a text written by a captive under conditions of persecution, which in the words of a recently influential American political philosopher, gives rise to a peculiar technique of writing, in which the truth about all crucial things is presented exclusively between the lines. Second, Omar's manuscript and other contemporary accounts refer to readers' connections and networks of transmission that ought to influence our view of how Omar's contemporaries read his text. These sources sketch a map of individuals who not only struggled with the legacy of the slavery they had imposed on Omar and his kin, but whose writings, both earnest and blinkered, sincere and cynical, underscore the multiple facets of Omar's identity: an Arabic speaker, a Muslim, a Fulbe, a West African informant, an American slave, an anti-colonizationist. Their texts limn a man whose autobiography is tied to Liberia, to North Carolina, to Lebanon, a part of the master narrative of American slavery, but also informing the less well-known master narrative of early 19th century Arab Nahda, or Renaissance, in Ottoman Syria. Who asked Omar to write his life story? And what was the purpose of an autobiography that almost no American could read? Languages make communities, but which kind? Some thinkers still live with the romantic notion of an organic bond between subjectivity and a mother language, tying tribe and tongue. The American notion of multiculturalism has, if anything, given a twist to this belief, implicitly assuring us that respect for the many ethnic and racial cultures that compose the United States is compatible with English monolingualism and linguistic assimilation. What multiculturalism apparently did not do, asserts Margaret Talbot in a recent issue of the New York Times Magazine, was promote the study of other languages, or indeed of other cultures. But the writing and reading of Omar's life, as well as the production of other non-English literary texts in the United States, demonstrate that more interesting and vital than the Herderian Volk of native speakers is the group of persons who find themselves connected through their often imperfect knowledge of a second language, one which they learn with effort and for a purpose. The existence of this linguistic community underscores another facet of the story of Omar's manuscript. It points to a second-order narrative, not of the content and Arabic textual analysis of Omar's life, but of the community of men who read Omar's life, each in his own manner. In order to read Omar's text, we ought to take into account Roger Chartier's seminal examination of the history of the book, which stresses the commonalities and mysteries of how readers in other times have read the same set of words we might be reading today. Omar's manuscript includes a title page that offers clues to its readership, pointing to a network of correspondents who performed work on his text, translating and circulating it, marveling at its strange but noble language, and who occasionally were even able to read it themselves, but most often heard about it from others. This title page, written in English in a different hand, and probably a later edition, identifies the author as Omar Ibn Said, called Moro, a Fullah slave, in Fayetteville, North Carolina, owned by Governor Owen. The narrative, continues the inscription, was written by himself in 1831 and sent to Old Paul, or Laman Kebi, in New York in 1836, presented to Theodore Dwight by Paul in 1836, translated by Honorable Alexander Cothiel, Esquire, 1848. Theodore Dwight, 1796 through 1866, who graduated from Yale in 1814, studying under his uncle Timothy, whose memory he revered, was a free soiler opposed to the spread of slavery. According to J. Franklin Jameson, a founder of the American Historical Association, who wrote the introduction to the first published translation of Omar's manuscript in 1925, reproduced in this volume, Dwight was deeply interested in West Africa and made special efforts to obtain information from or respecting Mohammedan slaves in the United States. Jameson presented a translation made by the Reverend Isaac Bird, 1793 through 1835, who had been a dozen years, 1823 through 1835, a missionary in Syria, with whom Dwight corresponded. Bird's translation was revised, added Jameson, through the kindness of Dr. F. M. Musa, Secretary of the Egyptian Legation in Washington, a Yale and Andover Seminary graduate and one of the so-called 7 pioneers who were early New England missionary envoys of the American Board of Commissioners for Foreign Missions, ABCFM, to Ottoman Syria. Byrd carried out what he called Bible work in Bible lands. But not only New Englanders influenced the reading of Omar's narrative. The manuscript title page does not mention the Georgia-born Orientalist William B. Hodgson, who traveled in West Africa and studied the local vernacular's relation to Arabic. Byrd's and Hodgson's writings shaped the views of Dwight, who had orchestrated the commissioning and circulation of several Arabic texts in the United States. My essay takes up some of these extra-textual meanings of Omar's narrative. Omar Ibn Said's life, as thin a confession and record of self-making as it might appear to a contemporary reader, is actually a thick text linking Arabic speakers and readers in distinct locales, language workers, who performed different tasks with Arabic. I would like to introduce the term Arabic work here, taking my cue from the title of Isaac Byrd's book to underscore that these men, including Omar, were non-native users of Arabic, and to highlight the global role of Arabic as an African language and as an American language, and of course, as the language of the Arabs, Muslim and Christian. Although no autobiography is a transparent account of its writer's life, for the literary act of implantment simultaneously separates and ties lived experience and artful narration, slave narratives were multiply mediated. Slaves had no direct access to printers and publishers. They wrote because they were persuaded to by white editors, who often co-wrote the slaves' autobiographies and had them published with one or more prefaces written by the editors. As John Blassingame asserts in relation to the historical value of the testimony of former slaves, since the antebellum narratives were frequently dictated to and written by whites, any study of such sources must begin with an assessment of the editors. Literary analysts, of course, do not regard these writings as evidence to be sifted, but our definition of the slave narrative genre must still incorporate the roles of its editors and readers. Insightful interpreters of African-American first-person narratives have recently drawn our attention to the strenuous conditions of authorship under which the ex-slave authors labored. It would seem that, when it came to telling their stories to white audiences in the North, the authors' troubles began after their escape. Scandals impugning the authenticity of 2 narratives of escaped slaves published in the North in the 1830s had threatened the continuing viability of the slave autobiographies. Northern emancipators and editors of slave narratives became fixated on ensuring that they directed, edited, and circulated true stories. Having good intentions, they cherished the power of slave narratives to aid them in the battle for emancipation, but having a racially tainted moral view of blacks, they saw the free slaves as potential liars, whose published writings or speech ought to be protected for the cause from the slave's own exaggeration and trickery. In a letter to the Emancipator, a leader of the American Anti-Slavery Society warned Northern readers that, simple-hearted and truthful as these fugitives appeared to be, you must recollect that they are slaves, and that the slave, as a general thing, is a liar, as well as a drunkard and a thief. Anne Fabian has observed how the editor of James Williams's Life, for instance, sought to convince his readers of the ex-slave's reliability by employing one of the key devices of authenticity. He assured readers that Williams had successfully repeated the events of his life on several occasions, and he listed in a footnote the names of gentlemen who have heard the whole or part of his history from his own lips. Fabian stresses that the slave narratives did not always end with the narrator's incorporation into a free society. They ended with narrators on the lecture circuit, no longer enslaved, to be sure, but suspended somewhere between slavery and freedom. The unfinished form of the ex-slaves' narratives invited audiences to participate with probing questions. The ex-slave had to prove that he recognized the difference between truth and lies, between experience and invention, often authenticating his suffering by displaying his scarred body. These displays were negative rituals. seeking to reduce the slave's narrative to a mold that guaranteed its truth, not to elaborate on his or her captivity, an elaboration that no doubt would vary with the ex-slave's historical and cultural background. Such ceremonial strategies of authentication, repeating the same sequence of events, sticking to the facts of slavery, attestations by Southern whites, sought, critics now emphasize, to overcome these narratives' most authentic truth, the fact, unknown to these white editors, that absolute perfect truth could not be used to measure the value of Afro-American autobiography, since the demands of truthfulness and self-preservation were often at odds in the experience of blacks in America, although, as William Andrews states, experienced abolitionists recognized that first-person narration, with its promise of intimate glimpses into the mind and heart of an escaped slave, would be much more compelling to the uncommitted mass of readers than the oratory and polemics of the anti-slavery press. These editors and handlers steered the ex-slave toward rhetorical strategies that obscured him or her behind the universally applicable facts of slavery. One is struck, then, by the fact that, but for the literary evolution of the black memorialists themselves and their growing consciousness of the moral and rhetorical worth of their particular experiences, slave narratives would have continued to privilege the editor's attestations of the slave's veracity, what Robert Steptoe has called an authenticating machinery, over the slave's own words. These authenticating strategies and documents were elements in a developing literary template, from which the ex-slaves were discouraged to deviate. These editors lacked interest in and regard for their charges' various histories and backgrounds. A truthful slave narrative was an account that stuck to the facts, eschewing subjective judgments or feelings. As both Steptoe and Andrews show, however, African-American writers resisted, often quietly, but occasionally openly and explicitly, such a depreciation of their particular experiences. The two alienating alternatives of impersonal objectivity or unreliable subjectivity. Omar's narrative is a product of its context, and in order to understand its nuances, we must avoid a Whig history of American slavery that divides the United States before the Civil War into abolitionists and slaveholders. As Thomas Hiatala insists, the concern with slavery must also be seen as part of a far more pervasive national concern with determining the future of the black man in a predominantly white society. Many Americans accepted that slavery was a doomed institution, but did not support emancipation. In 1817, some of them founded the American Colonization Society, ACS, an organization dedicated to solving both the slavery problem and the problem of the incompatibility of the races by encouraging free blacks to immigrate to and colonize what is today Liberia. Rejecting or eschewing a condemnation of the institution of slavery itself, or calls for the immediate emancipation of all slaves, these intellectual reformers, missionaries, politicians, and journalists, sought to prove the intellectual and moral worth of particular slaves, a worth that they argued made them unfit for slavery. When it came to Omar Ibn Said and other Muslim slaves, the ACS intellectuals, influenced by their ethnographic interests, saw that value in these slaves' literacy, education, and surprisingly, in their Islamic religion. In ironic contradistinction to the Northern abolitionists' benevolent but tepid autobiographical templates, these Southern colonizationists, racialist as their immigration endeavors were, attempted to win masters to their cause and more manumitted slaves for Liberia by interviewing slaves and collecting and publishing slaves' distinctive experiences or particular histories. Their fascination with certain distinguished blacks, free or slave, often led these colonizationists to solicit, circulate, and publicize their biographies and histories. Although this valuing of literacy echoes the beliefs about the escaped slaves in the North, that the slave's acquisition of his voice is quite possibly his only permanent achievement once he escapes. The differences between abolitionists' and colonizationists' viewpoints are significant. That Omar and other Arabic writing slaves were masters of alphabets and words that their masters ignored or admired and marveled at, endowed them with more independent and impressive cultural glamour. It also tied them to a nascent...
Sample complete. Ready to continue?